General Elias Thorne stood on the bridge of the Ruthless, staring out into the endless void of space. The gleaming city of Earth, seen through the expansive windows of the battlecruiser, appeared peaceful, serene, even against the chaotic cosmos. But to Thorne, this was nothing more than a reflection of humanity's indomitable power. He'd led wars across galaxies, subdued entire species, and crushed rebellions with surgical precision. The Earth Empire was an unstoppable force, and he was the hand that wielded it. Thorne was not a man prone to doubts. A veteran of countless battles, his mind was a war machine itself, calculating every move, every outcome before it even happened. Humanity had learned from its past mistakes and now stood at the top of the galactic hierarchy. Yet despite his cold demeanor, Thorne couldn't shake the feeling that something else was out there, something waiting. That feeling had become a whisper in the back of his mind as Earth expanded deeper into the galaxy, but Thorne had learned to silence his instincts. Arrogance, after all, had kept humanity alive and thriving. The harsh beep of the terminal cut through his thoughts, and Thorne turned to face the message on the screen. It was from the Serenai, the very race that had been the subject of recent discussions. His officers had been trying to get him to focus on them for weeks, but Thorne was uninterested. To him, they were just another species desperate to hold on to their fading relevance in the universe. The message flickered, displaying the strange symbols of the Serenai language. Thorne sneered as he watched the translation appear beneath it. Humanity's unchecked expansion will lead to the destruction of all. Cease your aggression, or face the consequences. Thorne's lip curled into a dismissive smile. He didn't even need to respond. In fact, he barely even considered it a threat. The Serenai were an ancient race. They claimed to be energy-based beings capable of bending the very fabric of space and time. But to Thorne, they were just another relic, another species that thought it could stand in the way of humanity's rise. Prepare the fleet, Thorne ordered. It's time we showed them who's in charge. One of his officers, Lieutenant Elena Cortez, hesitated before speaking. General, we've received multiple reports. The Serenai have weapons unlike anything we've seen before. It's not just their ships, it's the very environment they control. Thorne turned to her, his eyes narrowing. I don't care what they control. I've fought aliens who could tear apart planets with their minds. They won't be any different. Cortez looked uneasy, but she didn't question him. Thorne was right in the sense that humanity had faced overwhelming odds before, and had triumphed. He trusted in the Empire's technology, its overwhelming firepower. He trusted that the might of human ingenuity would crush whatever they faced. The Ruthless slid smoothly into warp, leading a battalion of ships toward the Serenai's home sector. The fleet was a masterpiece of human engineering, a symbol of everything Earth had become, a towering beacon of destruction. Yet as they approached the Serenai's territory, something odd happened. The stars around them seemed to flicker, as if they were fading in and out of existence. The deep space ahead rippled like water disturbed by an unseen force. The communication system buzzed. Another message from the Serenai. The translated words were simple, but chilling. You have sealed your fate. Thorne's smile faltered, just for a moment. He could feel the tension on the bridge, the uncertainty creeping into the minds of his officers. Cortez took a step forward. General, this isn't normal, she said, her voice trembling. We're in the heart of their territory now. If they could have attacked, they would have already. There's something we're missing. Thorne shook his head, silencing her. Stop second-guessing, Lieutenant. They're bluffing. Now, give the order to attack. The moment his command was given, the fleet surged forward, weapons primed and ready for combat. Thorne watched as the first shots were fired at the shimmer in the distance. The Serenai ships didn't appear to be there, but the energy pulses streaked through the void regardless. For a split second, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the Ruthless shook violently as an enormous energy wave engulfed the fleet. Thorne's stomach dropped as the starboard side of his ship vanished, consumed by a massive wave of distortion. The energy tore through the ship's hull like paper, leaving no trace of what had been there. What the hell was that? Thorne barked, his voice shaking for the first time in years. The energy, it's tearing through space itself, one of the engineers called out. We're losing power, General. Shields are collapsing. Thorne's mind raced as he stared at the screen in front of him. His fleet was being wiped out, no, erased, from existence. The Ruthless began to drift aimlessly, the remaining ships around them flickering like faint ghosts. Activate the warp drive, Thorne ordered, his voice steady, even though panic was gnawing at him. The engineers worked feverishly, but the warp drive sputtered, unable to generate the necessary power. The distortion in space was too much for their technology to overcome. General, we're trapped. Cortez shouted, her voice full of fear. We can't escape. Our systems are being shut down, every system is being disrupted. Thorne's mind raced, trying to find a solution. He couldn't just run. He couldn't. The Serenai had to be wiped out, for the sake of humanity. But as he watched, helpless, the Ruthless and the rest of the fleet continued to disintegrate, becoming nothing more than flashes of light swallowed by the chaos. And then, another voice spoke, this one not through the ship's intercom, but directly into his mind. You have no idea what you're facing, General. Thorne's heart stopped. He looked around, his breath quickening. The voice, it wasn't human. It wasn't even alien. It was something older, more powerful than anything he could comprehend. Something that transcended the very fabric of reality. You were warned, the voice continued. Humanity's arrogance will be its undoing. Thorne's fists clenched. He had been so sure of his victory, so certain that no force could stop humanity's ascendancy. But now, he realized, the Serenai had already won. The battle was over, the human fleet was gone. And Elias Thorne, the man who had never lost, was now facing something far worse than any enemy, his own failure. The Ruthless drifted, its massive bulk floating through the void like a dying star, and Thorne couldn't suppress the growing knot in his stomach. He had seen many things in his career, but nothing like this. His fleet was being torn apart, not by weapons, but by forces beyond his comprehension. His ship's systems were failing, the once shining beacons of humanity's might now flickering dimly against the dark abyss of space. General, we've lost contact with the Ironclad, the communications officer said, her voice strained. The ship, it just vanished. Thorne's eyes narrowed. The Ironclad had been one of the toughest ships in the fleet, heavily armored and bristling with firepower. If it had been destroyed, there was no telling what would happen to the rest of them. He gritted his teeth, watching as one by one, his ships flickered in and out of existence. Lieutenant Cortez, Thorne said, his voice hard as steel, where's the Serenai fleet? Cortez, standing rigidly beside him, looked at the empty expanse of space. Her brow furrowed. I don't see them, General. It's almost as if they don't need ships. They're everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Before Thorne could respond, the Ruthless rocked again, this time harder than before. The hull screamed under the pressure, and an alarm blared as the shields collapsed entirely. All around them, the sky twisted as reality itself seemed to shift. The crew scrambled, shouting commands, but nothing seemed to matter. The laws of physics were being violated. Time and space warped, bending in ways that made Thorne's head spin. General, Cortez said, gripping his arm. We have to pull back. This is not just a battle. This is war, Thorne snarled, cutting her off. His voice was cold, sharper than any blade. And we do not retreat. We never retreat. He slapped his comms panel, barking into it. All ships, rally to my position. We fight back, or we die trying. The crew's efforts to regroup were futile. One by one, the remaining ships flickered out, pulled into an unknown void by the energy storms that the Serenai had unleashed. As the last of his fleet crumbled, Thorne was left alone with his thoughts and the echoing sound of his own arrogance. Suddenly, a strange voice boomed in his mind, cutting through the chaos. It was the Serenai, but it wasn't coming from the comms. Humanity's arrogance will be your undoing, General Thorne. The voice was calm, soothing even. It wasn't threatening, but it was unnervingly certain. Thorne clenched his fists. The audacity. They were toying with him, mocking him. You think you can just erase us? Thorn's voice roared in his mind. You're wrong. You will see the power of humanity. Our will cannot be broken. The voice responded, now laced with a hint of pity. Your strength is a mirage, General. You have not yet understood the true nature of your enemy. The Serenai are not mere warriors. We are the keepers of reality itself. The message cut off abruptly, and in its place, a series of blinding flashes erupted across the ruthless bridge. Thorn's vision blurred as the lights flickered, but his resolve remained. He grabbed the comms panel once more, his voice cold. This isn't over, he said, even as his ship continued to spiral into chaos. We will fight them on our terms. For the first time, Thorn began to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. But he immediately crushed the thought. Humanity had faced adversity before and triumphed. They were fighters. They were survivors. And he, General Elias Thorn, was the spearhead of humanity's unyielding will. Lieutenant Cortez, he said, his voice low but firm. Give me a full readout. Find any weakness. Anything. Cortez worked rapidly at her station, her fingers flying over the controls. General, I'm not sure what's happening, but the ship's stabilizing. Not much, but it's something. She paused for a moment, eyes wide with a mix of fear and fascination. General, the Serenai, they're only manipulating the immediate space around them. Their control doesn't extend beyond this proximity. Thorn's eyes narrowed as he processed the information. This was it, their weakness. He had been blinded by his own pride, but now, the opportunity was clear. The Serenai had immense power within their grasp, but it was not infinite. They could control only what was close to them. The vast emptiness of space, the void between stars, was beyond their reach. We can fight them, Thorn murmured, as if realizing it for the first time. His mind started working, formulating a plan. We hit them with everything we have, but we stay outside their reach. We'll use their own power against them. General, Cortez said hesitantly, you want us to attack from the edge of their influence? That's suicidal. We can't take them head-on. Thorn's jaw tightened, and he looked at the vast emptiness outside. The Serenai's power was overwhelming, yes, but it had limits. And that was all he needed. One weakness. One opening. Humanity had always thrived because it adapted, because it learned and overcame. We fight smart, he said, his voice hard. We hit them fast and hit them hard. We'll use our smaller, more agile ships to flank their energy fields. If we can isolate them long enough, they won't be able to manipulate the battlefield. Then we move in for the kill. He turned toward the crew, who were watching him with a mixture of fear and hope. He knew the odds were slim. He knew this could be their last stand. But there was no retreat. Not for him. Not for humanity. Prepare the fleet. We're going to make them regret ever underestimating us. As the crew scrambled to execute his orders, Thorn stepped back, his thoughts racing. The Serenai had underestimated humanity. They thought their power, their control over reality, was enough to break them. But Thorn was certain of one thing: humanity's greatest strength wasn't just in its technology, its ships, or its weapons. It was in its will to survive, to fight against all odds, and to never give up. He clenched his fists. This was just the beginning. The ship groaned, and Thorn could feel the strain in every fiber of his being. He hadn't been wrong. There was a weakness, a crack in the Serenai's power, and it was his only chance. Humanity's survival depended on exploiting that single flaw. Cortez, get me a tactical grid of the Serenai's energy disturbances, he ordered, his voice sharp. Cortez's fingers flew across the controls, but there was hesitation in her movements. I'm not sure this will work, General. Their power is... I don't need a lecture on their power, Lieutenant, Thorn snapped, his tone like a whip. We have one shot. We either take it or we die. He could feel her frustration mounting, but she had no choice but to obey. After a few tense seconds, she muttered, "Got it. There's a pattern to their energy surges. It's irregular, but consistent. If we can disrupt their field at the right moment," Thorne's mind raced. The Serenai were manipulating reality, but they couldn't control everything at once. There was a window, slim, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A brief moment where they couldn't twist the fabric of space and time. The timing had to be precise, or it would all be over. "Prepare the weapon systems. Full power to the pulse cannons," Thorne commanded. "We're going to break through their field. All we need is that opening." "General, it's too risky," Cortez protested, her voice laced with panic. "You're talking about engaging them head-on, at their full strength. We're already losing ships." "We've already lost everything," Thorne replied, his voice ice-cold. "The time for caution is over." He slammed a fist against the console. "This is war. And humanity doesn't lose wars." Cortez fell silent, her face pale but resolute. She knew better than to argue with Thorne when his mind was set. They had been through too much together. She trusted him, even if she feared this plan would destroy them all. The Ruthless shuddered again, the flickering energy from the Serenai's attacks causing the hull to rattle. Thorne ignored it. He had no time for fear. Only action. "Target the center of their energy fluctuations," he said, eyes locked on the data display. "Concentrate all firepower into that point. We only need to make a dent." Cortez hesitated. "General, the calculations are still off. If we miss, there's no way we can defend ourselves." Thorne turned to face her, his jaw clenched. "You're either with me, or you're not, Lieutenant. You know what's at stake." The silence that followed was deafening. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then, Cortez nodded. "Firing solution ready, General," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "On your command." Thorne stood at the helm, his mind still calculating the next move. They would hit them. They would tear open the veil of invulnerability the Serenai had surrounded themselves with, or they would be swallowed whole. The seconds felt like hours. The entire ship seemed to be holding its breath. Thorne knew the risks. If the blast didn't disrupt the Serenai's field, they were as good as dead. But if it did, they would have a fighting chance. Fire. The moment the order left his lips, the ship roared with power. The Ruthless unleashed a devastating surge of energy, the pulse cannons firing with a force that rattled Thorne's very bones. For an instant, the ship seemed to stop moving, as if everything had been frozen in time. Then the burst of energy collided with the Serenai's field. Reality itself seemed to crack. The entire universe shuddered as the blast hit. The space around them trembled, as though the very fabric of existence was bending under the weight of the attack. Thorne's heart raced. Had it worked? Had they managed to breach the Serenai's defenses? For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a massive explosion of energy erupted before them. The field flickered and wavered, rippling like the surface of a pond disturbed by a stone. The Ruthless lurched forward, and Thorne's breath caught in his throat. "Did we?" Cortez began, but her voice faltered as the energy waves from the explosion reverberated through the ship. "Keep firing," Thorne commanded, his voice strained. "We've got them." The Ruthless fired again, the energy pulses slamming into the cracks in the Serenai's field. The air seemed to grow thick with tension. The Serenai were reeling. They hadn't expected this. They had underestimated humanity's resolve. Underestimated him. "I told you," Thorne muttered under his breath. "We never retreat." The Serenai's response was swift. The energy around them flickered again, and the space around the Ruthless twisted violently. Thorne felt it in his gut, a sickening, dizzying sensation. It was as if the ship was being pulled in every direction at once. He could hear the cries of his crew as the reality-altering energy surrounded them, threatening to tear them apart. But he wasn't finished. "Shields, full power!" Thorne barked. "Brace for impact." The ship shuddered again, and Thorne could feel the sweat pouring down his face. His mind raced faster than his body could keep up. There was no turning back now. The Serenai would not stop until they destroyed them, but he couldn't let them win. The Ruthless surged forward, plowing through the waves of energy that bent space around them. Thorn's fingers tightened on the armrests of his command chair as he looked ahead, refusing to flinch. For the first time since the attack had begun, he saw something unexpected, a flicker of hope. The Serenai were struggling to maintain their grip on reality. Their power, once overwhelming, was now starting to slip. They were faltering. Now, Thorn whispered, his eyes narrowing. Another blast. This time, the Ruthless fired everything they had. The concentrated force of the pulse cannons, combined with the Serenai's weakening field, collided with a sound that seemed to tear the very stars apart. The ship bucked under the impact, but Thorn held his ground, his mind focused only on one thing, survival. The Serenai's field shattered. Reality cracked open like a broken glass pane, and the energy storm dissipated. The stars came into view again. But there was no time to celebrate. Thorn knew that the Serenai wouldn't be gone for long. This victory was but a momentary reprieve. They would return with greater force. Thorn stood, his eyes hard as steel. Prepare for the next battle. Humanity's fight is just beginning. Cortez met his gaze, her eyes reflecting the same fire that burned within him. We'll be ready, General. And with that, Thorn knew, this war, this fight for humanity's survival, would be won not by sheer power alone, but by the unbreakable will that had carried them this far. The surge of energy sent waves through the ship, rattling it to its very core. Thorn's grip tightened on the command console as the Ruthless shook violently, the walls groaning under the pressure. His heart was racing. He had felt the twist in reality, an unnatural, oppressive force that threatened to tear them apart. He didn't need to see the damage to know what was happening. The Serenai were retaliating, and it was worse than he'd anticipated. General. Cortez's voice cut through the chaos. They're tearing at the fabric of space. We can't maintain this much longer. Thorn's teeth clenched, his mind running through every possible scenario. The Serenai were manipulating space itself, bending reality like it was a plaything. But they had one fatal flaw: humans had never needed reality to be kind to them. They had survived wars, plagues, and impossible odds. This would be no different. Deploy the secondary phase, Thorn barked, his voice sharp and clear. It's now or never. Cortez hesitated, fingers hovering over the controls. Are you sure? The backup systems weren't designed for this, now, Cortez. Thorn's voice broke through the noise, firm and resolute. The backup systems kicked in, sending a fresh surge of power through the ship. The air seemed to hum with the intensity of it, as though the entire vessel was ready to break apart. But Thorn didn't care. He didn't care about the Ruthless, about the crew, or even about the Serenai. He cared only about victory. The ship surged forward, a streak of blinding light against the distorted, nightmarish backdrop of shifting reality. The Serenai had underestimated humanity's ability to adapt. They had assumed their control over the universe could shackle the will of humankind. But they were wrong. Target the central core, Thorn ordered, his voice a growl. Concentrate all energy on the heart of their field. The energy surged once more. A pulse of devastating force shot forward, tearing through the remaining distortions in the fabric of reality. Thorn didn't wait for confirmation. His gaze never left the chaotic battlefield, his mind sharp, calculating. It had to work. There was no other option. The space around them flickered, and for a brief moment, the Serenai's energy field shattered. A thin crack, no wider than a hair's breadth, appeared in their seemingly impenetrable shield. The Ruthless rocked, the entire ship lurching forward in the wake of the blast. This was the opening they needed. Fire again. Thorn roared, his voice shaking with a mixture of triumph and desperation. The Ruthless unleashed everything it had. The concentrated energy from the backup systems, all focused on the single weak point in the Serenai's defenses, collided with a deafening impact. The universe itself seemed to scream as the Serenai's field crumpled under the assault. It wasn't enough to destroy them, but it was enough to destabilize them. The battle was far from over, but Thorn had done it. He had forced the Serenai to react. To bleed. "This is our moment," Thorn muttered, his fists clenched in determination. "We finish them here." The Ruthless raced forward, pushing through the cracks in reality. The Serenai were reeling, their movements erratic, their energy field flickering dangerously. But Thorn knew that this wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The Serenai were an ancient force, and their power wasn't easily snuffed out. Then came the silence. It was sudden, jarring. The violent storms of energy that had once surrounded them had vanished, leaving nothing but the eerie emptiness of space. Thorn's heart skipped a beat. It was too quiet. Too still. Cortez's voice crackled through the comms. "General. I think we've done it. The field is gone." There, before she could finish, a voice, impossibly ancient and cold, reverberated through the ship's communication systems. It wasn't a voice in the traditional sense, it was more like a thought, a presence that seeped into every corner of the vessel. "You think you have one, human?" The voice was a low hum, unsettling in its calmness. "You have only awakened the true power of the Serenai." Thorn froze. The silence that followed the voice was deafening, and for the first time in his military career, doubt crept into his mind. Had they made a mistake? "General, what's happening?" Cortez asked, her voice tinged with fear. Thorn's fingers tightened around the console. "Keep your focus, Lieutenant. We've come too far to back down now." Suddenly, the Ruthless shuddered violently again. Thorn's eyes widened as the ship began to distort, the very space around them bending, twisting into impossible angles. The stars outside the ship's windows bent into arcs, stretching and shrinking in ways that defied all logic. "Brace for impact," Thorn shouted, his voice commanding despite the chaos. "Get to the escape pods. Now." It was too late. The Serenai were not a species that could be defeated so easily. Their power was beyond anything humanity could fathom. They were not just beings, they were forces of nature. Thorn could feel it now. The entire universe around him was bending, warping, as if it had been stretched beyond its breaking point. The walls of the Ruthless buckled, groaning under the weight of the shifting reality. Thorn didn't have time to think, only to act. He grabbed the nearest control panel and ripped it open, desperate to find something, anything, that could stop this. His hands flew over the buttons and switches, trying to make sense of the chaos. Suddenly, there was a sharp, piercing noise, louder than any explosion, and the ship's main control room was flooded with blinding light. Thorn slammed his hands over his eyes, but it was no use. The light burned through his eyelids, through his very soul. And then, nothing. For a moment, the universe held its breath. There was no sound, no movement, no sensation. Just emptiness. Thorn wasn't sure if he was still alive. If any of them were still alive. But when his vision cleared, he saw it, the Serenai, in their true form. Not as beings of energy, but as something far more terrifying. They were towering figures of light, made of pure energy, their bodies shifting and flickering like flames in the wind. Their eyes were endless voids, staring into him with a depth that made his stomach turn. "You have seen the true power of the Serenai," their voice echoed in his mind, chilling him to his core. "And now, you shall face the consequences of your arrogance." Thorn could only stare. His mind raced as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His victory had been an illusion, a fleeting moment in time. The Serenai were far beyond anything humanity could comprehend, but he wasn't done yet. "No," Thorn whispered. "We're not done yet."